Welcome to CWS Christian Writing and Speaking. I'm your host, Jackie Wilson, and today's guest says church is where an insecure 16-year-old girl should feel welcome, happy, and most importantly, safe. Tragically for some, the church can become a place of great harm. For her, she experienced the deceit and lies that come with being the victim of a wolf in sheep's clothing. In particular, it was her church's youth minister. After decades of keeping her deep secret, she discovered her voice and has made it her life's work to be an advocate for others. You may know her book. It is called Let Me Prey, P-R-E-Y, Upon You. And in this book, she takes us on a journey of healing, which began for her in 2004. Let's welcome to the CWS stage, Miss Sandy Kirkham. Welcome,
Hi.
Sandy.
Thank you for having me here today.
Yes, I am excited to hear your story, not because of the tragedy of it, but because of its empowering effect. And so we want you to share your story of what happened. How did this begin? What can parents look for? What should we be doing? And then we want to hear about your book. So, Sandy, will you share your story?
Well, my story is one, sadly, that occurs a lot. I hate to say that, but it's a topic we need to talk about. I started attending church when I was about 8 years old. My best friend up the street asked me to go with them. My parents did not attend church and absolutely fell in love with church from the time I started going, from the time I was 8 years old. I went to church school. I went to vacation Bible school. I love Sunday school, everything about it. As I grew in my faith and as I grew older, I started teaching Sunday school. I sang in the choir. I was leading retreats. So I would say it was no stretch of the imagination to say if the doors of the church were open, I was there. Yeah. Shortly after I turned 16, our church hired a new youth pastor who was very dynamic, very charismatic. He came with a lot of new ideas. And shortly after his arrival, our church began to grow. This was in the 70s. It was before the mega churches. But if mega churches had existed then, he certainly would have been one of the top preachers at the time. His sermons were outstanding. Everyone loved this man. We were all enthralled with him. And because of my leadership prior to his arrival, it was to no one's surprise that he tapped into me to be one of the leaders of the youth group. And so he started taking me under his wings. My parents were divorced, and so I didn't see my father a lot during my teenage years. And so I looked at him as a father figure, and he tapped into that vulnerability and spent about a year, I would say, grooming me, keeping me under his wing. I had total trust in him as my pastor. But it was one night after a youth group meeting in my home. He waited for everyone to leave. He bent down and he kissed me. And I can remember thinking, oh my gosh, I think he just kissed me. It was kind of an innocent kiss. So I didn't quite understand. And I didn't want to accuse my pastor of doing something he shouldn't be doing. So I thought, well, this is just his way of showing how much he appreciates all that I've been doing in the church, because he was always telling me how much he needed me in the church and how much he appreciated everything I was doing. So it was the only way I could rationalize it. Following that year, a continuum of a year, he was always praising me and putting me in positions in the church of leadership. And so I started to develop this relationship with him, not knowing that his ultimate goal would be to have sex with me, which he eventually did. Wow. Once that happened, I could no longer justify it. I knew in my heart this was wrong. I lost my virginity to this person, which was a married man with 2 children, and he was my pastor. And I had a tremendous amount of guilt, but I didn't know how to get out of it. He made it very clear from the beginning that I could tell no one, that no one would believe me. And if I were to tell anyone, whatever would happen would be my fault. And so I was held under his thumb in this control based on the fact that I truly believed that I wouldn't be believed. And I was afraid of what would happen if I told anyone. The abuse lasted for 5 years. It became physical as well as emotional. There were times in the beginning that I tried to get out of the relationship. I would go to him, tell him I was feeling guilty, that I didn't want to do this anymore. I mean, I was 16 years old and I wanted to have a happy teenage life. And here I was tied to this man who I had no future with, who was emotionally and physically abusing me. But eventually he would wear me down to a point that I no longer felt like I could get out of the relationship. He was constantly telling me that no one else could love me. I was no longer a virgin, so no one else would want me.
Wow.
He would begin to misuse scripture and say that this was God's will. I was so confused and with such low self-esteem that at one point I gave up and just thought, this is my life and this will be over when he says it's over. It did end because he was caught. We were caught in a hotel room. And at that point, the church leadership decided that he had asked for forgiveness so that he should be forgiven. So he was moved to the next church. He was given a going away party, and no mention of was actually said of why he was leaving. There were a few people who did know. I think in all churches or any establishment, if a few people know, then more people are going to find out. And so there were some that knew in the church, but most people did not know. About 3 months after he left, I was called in by the elders and told because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. I was devastated. I have difficulty now talking about that pain, being told that I wasn't fit to worship in a church that I had loved and served. And that, to me, probably had more of an effect on my life going forward than the actual abuse, because I felt so unworthy. I mean, how bad do you have to be kicked out of a church? And I could see that he had been forgiven. So I really saw that it was all my fault. They blamed me, and therefore it was my fault. So for 27 years, I lived with the guilt and the shame. And for 27 years, I never saw it as abuse, but that I had consented to an affair with a married man who was my pastor, which was not the case. It was a trigger factor that sent me over the edge to a point where I knew I had to deal with this. And so I eventually told my best friend, and that began my journey of healing. I waited to tell my husband. I knew in the back of my mind that he would be loving and caring, but that fear of being judged, that fear of him seeing me differently sexually, that fear that he would wonder why I kept the secret from him, and the words of my abuser constantly in the back of my mind saying, you're not going to be believed, always was there for me. And so I eventually did tell him, and he was, of course, responded in the way that I knew that he would. From there, I just began my journey of healing, which was not easy. It took a lot of soul searching. I had to begin to understand that what was done to me was abuse. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't someone who cared about me. This was someone who used his position of trust, who used his position in a spiritual way to take advantage of a vulnerable teenager. And that I didn't have the coping skills emotionally in any venue to be able to say no to this person and understand what was happening to me. Once I understood the terms grooming, gaslighting, and manipulation, and saw that those were all the things he had done to me, was when I could begin to heal. And then my healing would take place in a way of helping others. I volunteer for a ministry called the Hope of Survivors Ministry. I serve on the board of Council on Child Abuse. I began to understand that my story and my experience could help other victims, which is in part why I wrote the book. I'd often wondered over the years, what if I'd heard someone's story when I was going through my own abuse? Would it have given me the courage to come forward and tell someone? Would it have given me the courage to understand that I was being abused if I had heard someone else's story? And so while our stories are not all the same and our trauma is not all the same, we share a lot of similarities and we can help each other through our stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned the book. It's called Let Us Pray, Prey.
Well, there's the book.
Upon You.
Yeah, let me pray upon you. Pastors and rabbis and priests, anyone a spiritual leader, they'll start with, let me pray with you. And it becomes, let me pray upon you. They use their spiritual roles to trap you. They target their victims. They look for vulnerable victims. They look for people who are emotionally needy, people who have a crisis in their life. And they tap into that vulnerability in a way to seemingly help them, only to take advantage of them later. So the book was also healing for me to write the book. But it's not just a book about my trauma and my abuse. It's also a book about healing and hope. I talk about how church leadership can work through abuses and spot predators. I talk about how the healing process worked for me. So it's not just a book about abuse, but it can help others who want to understand the dynamics of clergy abuse and why clergy abuse is different than other abuse. All abuse is horrific, but when you tap into someone's spiritual life and you contaminate it, you have taken a very special, precious part of their life and destroyed it in many ways. So many victims turn against God. I mean, this is the one thing we don't want to happen. And how do you find your way back spiritually? So in my book, I talk about that, and hopefully that's a help to other victims, but it's a help to help people understand why victims feel like God has deserted them.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was just thinking, let's give the people some more warning signs. One, one of the things you said was that the youth minister looked at how vulnerable you were,
Mm-hmm.
and he took advantage of that. He isolated you. What are some
Yes.
other things that people need to look for?
Pay attention to the child or even the vulnerable adult who is an emotionally needy and or has a crisis in their life. They're going through a divorce or they've got family dysfunction, because those are the ones that these predators will target. So pay attention to those people and maybe help fill those needs so that the predator isn't the one filling the needs. Then watch for a predator to spend too much time and too much vested interest in this individual. It's okay to be helpful, but is this person spending way too much time? Do they tend to spend time alone with this individual? One of the standards I think could be used is, don't dismiss behavior that you find a little uncomfortable simply because it's the pastor or the rabbi or the priest. We tend to think, well, that's a man of God. He would never be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. So you dismiss the warning signs. So the question could be asked, if this behavior were occurring in a neighbor or just a friend of yours, and you questioned it, would you accept that same behavior in that friend or that neighbor? If not, then you shouldn't accept it in the pastor or the rabbi or the priest. Watch for isolation. That is huge. They will tend to pull victims away from their friends, away from their families, so that the victim becomes totally dependent on the predator. And I don't want to sound like it's impossible to spot these predators, but keep in mind, they're very good at manipulation. They're very good at controlling people. So watch for those signs for someone who tends to be manipulative and someone who seems to play the victim sometimes. So if they're accused of any kind of misbehavior, their first response is, well, why would you think that of me? I would never do anything like that. Watch for their behavior. Those are just some of the things that I would say are ways we can look for predators.
Yeah, I love it. What is next for you? Because you're doing so much already. What is the next big project? Are you writing another book?
I've never tended to write a book, so I'm not really a writer. I didn't set out to write a book. I set out to find a way to help other victims. I was so frustrated by people's misunderstanding of victims, the questions of why do they wait so long and why didn't they tell someone, and how could that have happened under this guise of this church with all these people around, and why couldn't she tell someone? So I was frustrated in the sense that I needed to say, okay, from a victim's perspective, let me help you understand and answer those questions for you. I'm just going to really continue what I'm doing. I counsel victims. Like I said, I'm on this board of COCA, which is part of my life that I just delight in being a part of, because I think prevention is such a key to this. If we can teach our children and even our vulnerable adults how to spot predators, how to understand their own vulnerabilities and their own needs, and how to seek God through these answers opposed to an individual. I can't say I got one big thing on the horizon, but I am going to continue to do the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I just want to briefly mention this. There's a documentary about your life.
Yeah, you can go to the website, thehopeofsurvivors.com. That is an excellent website for anyone who's interested in learning more about clergy abuse, but it has a plethora of information for victims as well. And on there, you can find my documentary that was produced by the Hope of Survivors Ministry. And again, my book, I think, I'm proud of this book. I think it's a great help. I wish it could be in every church library. I think it's an important read for pastors and church leaders, especially elders. The pastor may read it, but he may be the predator. So it's the church elders and those who are responsible for dealing with the predators that need the information to understand. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't one of the things that I try to tell elders and church leadership is we need to stop calling it a moral fall or a failure of the heart or a sin of the heart. It's sexual abuse or it's misconduct. It's not, we need to start naming it so that we can deal with it in the right way.
Rape. It's rape.
Yes, we need to use the terms that it describes. A moral fall could be anything. My own abuser said, he called it a debacle. A debacle is when you lose your luggage at the airlines. That's a debacle. What he did to me was sexual abuse. And so when we sanitize the words, it makes it easier to let the predator go by, because then we can say, well, God forgives us, we should forgive him, or we shouldn't judge. I try to tell people, yes, we've all sinned, but there are consequences to sin.
Oh, yeah.
And they've lost that privilege of ministry when they've crossed that boundary. It's not to say that they can't be forgiven. They deserve all the grace that God gives to all of us after they've been truly repentant, but they've lost that privilege of ministry. That grace and that forgiveness should be given to them sitting in the back row of the church, not in the pulpit. They've lost that privilege. I think churches fail to see that. And I'm not judging my abusers, whether he's repented or not. I'm not judging whether he's going to heaven, or I'm not judging him as a person. I'm judging his ability to do his job. And he proved by his own actions that he was not fit for that job. By his own actions, he lost the privilege of ministry. No one took it away from him. He decided the moment that he was going to kiss me in my hallway that night, that he was going to risk his ministry. And these are wolves in sheep's clothing. They are pretending to be spiritual leaders, and we need to remember that. The Bible mentions sheep's and wolf's clothing 27 times. And I think Jesus knew that analogy would hit home with people. It's something that we can comprehend. We have this wolf among us, but we don't see him because he's so well disguised. And that's why predators can get away with this, because they are so well disguised, and they understand the sheep. They know what they can do to manipulate the sheep, the congregation, and those around them. And that's why they're so dangerous.
And it's probably not their first time.
It's not and if it is their first time, there'll be a second time and a third time. I was not his first victim. My church elders knew that he'd had an incident in his first church and still continued to allow him. Really, read the book. It's in it. The story is, my experiences. It's pretty incredible, some of the things that happened to me during my abuse. But yes, I was not his second victim. Then when he was moved to the next church, guess what happened?
Yes, another one.
Another one. And then there was another one. I hired a private investigator and confronted him 27 years later. And that was quite a challenge and did take a lot of courage on my part. But I felt I needed to be able to look him in the eye and say to him, what you did to me was wrong and you had no right to do it. I just want to be sure that people understand that we need to take this issue on and tackle it and understand the predator, understand how they operate, understand the dynamics of abuse, and then clearly understand the damage it does to victims. It's a lifelong impact. My chapter in the book is called Spiritual Wounds, and I talk about how my spiritual life has changed and how it's different and what he took away from me. And I mourn the loss of that spiritual life as I once knew it. And victims need to understand that it's okay to mourn what was taken from you, because what was taken from us was very precious, and it should never have happened, as you said earlier, in the safest place in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for just being brave enough to share your story. Please tell people how they can connect with you.
They can go to my website, which is simply my name, which is a little long, but it's Sandy, Sandy, Kirkham, Kirkham, Phillips, PHILLIPS.com. My website, you can contact me there. There's a lot of information for victims on that website. I also have a Facebook page, same thing, just my name. And then my book is available through my website, or it's available on Amazon as well.
Sandy, as we wrap up your interview, what is the one thing you feel like the audience absolutely needs to know?
I want to say two things to victims. Number one, it's not your fault what was done to you. You had every right to feel safe and secure in a place that should have been safe for you. And two, I would ask that you just educate yourself and learn the terms grooming, manipulation, gaslighting, because once you begin to understand what was done to you, you can let go of the guilt and the shame. Finally, I would say there's hope. There is hope and there is healing. It's not easy. I spent 27 years hiding this secret and keeping the guilt and the shame. And it wasn't until I was able to let go of it that I was able to start that healing process. So I say, tell someone if you've been sexually abused, whether it's in the church or not. And I say that knowing it's not easy, because I spent 27 years fearful of ever letting my secret out. But you cannot heal until you tell someone and let the truth be known.
Thank you so much for sharing, Sandy. CWS audience, you have heard her story. I challenge the church leadership. Wake up, pay attention. Parents,
Absolutely.
wake up, pay attention. And if you have been a victim of sexual assault, rape, or whatever they want to call it, there is hope for you. Start reaching out. Get the help that you need so that you can live a happy and hope-filled life. Thank
Great
you
ending.
so much for listening to today's episode. And until next time, beautiful people, God bless.